Scientists have confirmed a discovery more unsettling than anything revealed during the initial investigation. The transmission has not stopped. It is still unfolding at this very moment, pulsing through space with a stability and precision no natural source could produce, moving along the exact same vector from which 3I Atlas and N2 Sven originally entered our solar system, as though updating the intelligence that dispatched them with new, real-time information about everything that is happening on and around Earth. The first time this ongoing signal was detected, researchers believed it to be an echo, a residual artifact, a decaying remnant of the initial data return. But when frequency modulation remained coherent for more than 70 consecutive hours, when the energy profile refused to weaken, when spectral decomposition revealed a layered and continuously evolving structure, the truth became impossible to misinterpret. Someone or something is still receiving information about our world, and the probes that once seemed dormant are acting as active transmitters, maintaining a secure, adaptive channel to a destination far beyond our reach. What stunned the Scientific Council most was the unmistakable refinement in the new transmissions compared to the first wave. The earlier bursts carried dense packets of reconnaissance data, stacked and compressed according to categories now partially reconstructed. But the new stream is different. It is subtler, smoother, more responsive, shifting lightly across narrow spectral bands to avoid solar interference, as though someone were adjusting the channel from the far side, keeping the link open with the kind of precision that implies not merely intelligence but oversight. Even more chilling is the fact that the cadence of the pulses matches changes within Earth's own environment. Fluctuations in the magnetosphere, shifts in global radio output, variations in satellite activity, even the timing of human attempts to analyze the signal. At several points, the probes altered their modulation immediately after Earth's monitoring arrays increased their sensitivity, as if acknowledging the increased scrutiny and adjusting to maintain clarity. This is not a relic. This is a conversation silent on our end, but continuous on theirs. And as the Council assembled in emergency session once more, reviewing hour after hour of clean, undeniable data, the conclusions settled across the room like cold pressure. The transmission is not an aftershock. It is an operation still in progress, a secure stream carrying updated observations about Earth, its environment, its electromagnetic behavior, and its technological reactions straight back toward the point of origin. Whatever received the first transmission is now receiving the second, and whatever judgment they are forming is being informed not by who we think we are, but by what their machines are watching us become in real time. As the continuous transmission was analysed in full technical detail, the Scientific Council uncovered elements within the signal that shattered any remaining hope of interpreting it as a natural or passive phenomenon, because beneath the seemingly narrow band frequency lay an architecture so layered, so intentionally structured, and so highly adaptive that it immediately resembled the behaviour of a protected encrypted communication channel, rather than any astrophysical emission known to science. Signature itself, instead of behaving like a static encoded pulse, the signal adjusted its harmonic patterns every time it encountered interference, sliding across microfrequencies with a fluidity that suggested active error correction, the kind that only occurs when a sender and receiver are maintaining real-time stability across vast distances. Even more alarming was the discovery of sub-carrier channels, buried inside the main waveform compressed data streams, that activated only under specific celestial conditions, such as when Earth rotated into regions with less atmospheric absorption, or when solar wind density decreased just enough to improve long-range clarity. These hidden subchannels displayed uneven, pulsating envelopes consistent with layered packet fragmentation, as if the transmission were delivering information in independent, internally verified blocks, each containing its own checksum signatures, logical separators, and structural redundancies. Natural signals never contain such elements. Artificial ones almost always do. But what truly unsettled the researchers was the behaviour of the signal in moments when Earth's detection systems attempted to isolate it more directly. During multiple observation windows, when ground-based arrays boosted their gain power to capture a clearer waveform, the transmission shifted phase subtly enough to remain stable, yet changed its spectral posture just enough to make full interception more difficult, as if aware that it was being observed and compensating to maintain the integrity of the channel without revealing additional structure. This adaptive behaviour suggests an intelligence built into the probes themselves, or even more disturbingly, a distant receiver actively refining the connection in real time. The Council confirmed that the channel exhibits properties similar to Earth's most advanced encrypted military transmissions: multi-frequency hopping, layered error correction, internal compression algorithms, and an unmistakable waveform consistency, maintained not by environmental coincidence, but by operational intent. And when the directionality of the signal was matched precisely against the inbound trajectories of Atlas and Sven, the correlation reached nearly 100%, eliminating every alternative hypothesis. The transmissions are not drifting outward into space randomly. They are aimed with surgical precision at the same distant point from which the probes arrived, forming a permanent corridor of information flow. Someone on the far end is meant to receive it. Someone is keeping the channel open, and now, as the analytical layers peel back and the structure of the signal becomes clearer, the Council can no longer avoid the conclusion that the transmission is not only protected, it is intelligently maintained, evolving dynamically in response to cosmic conditions and human attempts at observation, as if the probes and the distant endpoint are working in tandem to ensure that no fragment of the data stream is lost. This is not just communication. This is a protected link, and Earth is not the recipient. As the investigation progressed and the analytical models grew more refined, the Scientific Council began to notice a pattern within the transmission that defied every known principle of unidirectional communication, because instead of behaving like a standalone outbound signal, the channel exhibited traits characteristic of systems engaged in continuous synchronization, adjusting its timing, amplitude, and harmonic drift in ways that implied an exchange of invisible feedback between the sender and an unseen receiver located far beyond the boundaries of our solar system. The most striking evidence came from the phase lag patterns. Tiny, precisely measured shifts in the waveform that varied according to Earth's position relative to the origin vector, yet remained too consistent to be caused by cosmological scattering or interstellar medium noise. These shifts aligned with a rhythm, a mathematical cadence, that suggested the transmission was being constantly recalibrated, as if the probes were responding to alignment cues coming from the other side of the void. Further analysis revealed micro-oscillations in the signal that only appeared after the main pulse reached certain thresholds, almost like confirmation blips acknowledging receipt, despite the fact that no detectable return signal was observed on any known frequency. Some researchers proposed the unsettling hypothesis that the returning feedback might be occurring on channels or physical processes we are currently incapable of detecting: gravitational micromodulations, vacuum state perturbations, or quantum-level resonance states that bypass electromagnetic detection entirely. The most conservative models still could not explain why the outbound signal adjusted itself with such consistency whenever Earth's monitoring arrays shifted their observation windows, unless the endpoint was actively correcting for distance, drift, and environmental noise. This implied the existence of a receiver capable of performing real-time calculations across interstellar distances, maintaining a clean and stable corridor with a precision far beyond our most advanced deep space communication systems. And what unnerved the Council most profoundly was the synchronization lag, a repeating, stable interval that made no sense for a unidirectional transmission, but made perfect sense for a channel performing handshake protocols timing loops designed to ensure a message is aligned before subsequent packets are sent. This pattern, repeated thousands of times over the monitoring period, led to a single terrifying conclusion. The transmission is not unilateral. It is part of a maintained link. The probes are not merely sending, they are adjusting. And they are adjusting because something on the far end is maintaining lock, holding the channel open and refining the stability of the connection. The silence we perceive from the other side is not silence at all. It is simply a form of communication occurring outside our sensory and technological range. The probes behave like nodes in a network small parts of a larger system, communicating with a central intelligence whose presence is concealed not by distance, but by the limitations of our understanding. And as the Council reviewed the synchronization data, the weight of the realization became clear. We are witnessing not the tail end of a message, but an actively sustained exchange. A channel kept alive by two parties. One we can see, and one we cannot. Both ensuring that the information flowing out of our solar system arrives exactly where it is meant to. This means only one thing: someone is still listening. as analysts began to separate the components of the ongoing transmission, peeling back its layers like the outer shells of an encrypted archive, it became clear that the data being sent now was not a repetition of the initial reconnaissance nor a simple echo of previously stored information, but a live dynamic stream composed of updated environmental readings, newly captured atmospheric patterns, revised electromagnetic profiles, and continuous samples of Earth's shifting technological noise, as though the probes had entered a secondary phase of their mission, specifically designed to supply the receiver with fresh situational data long after the initial survey was complete. The stream contained fine-grained variations in the magnetosphere's daily fluctuations, precise measurements of how Earth's upper atmosphere responded to solar wind pressure in the past several weeks, and real-time assessments of changes in the global distribution of radio emissions generated by satellites, communication networks, and military radar systems. Even more disturbing was the discovery of spectral threads containing signatures tied directly to events that occurred after the first transmission wave, such as subtle shifts in the thermal output of populated regions, changes in the composition of the ionosphere resulting from recent geological or technological activity, and micro-distortions in orbital traffic density caused by routine satellite adjustments. This confirmed that the probes are still scanning, still observing, and still compiling new information to send outward, not because they failed to complete the first mission, but because the entity on the receiving end requires an updated stream of fresh data that reflects Earth's responses to the initial anomalies. And as the Council synchronized the transmission's variations with Earth's own activity logs, a chilling correlation emerged. Every time global institutions amplified their monitoring, increased observation frequency, or attempted to intercept the signal more aggressively, the structure of the outbound data shifted accordingly, as if cataloguing the exact nature of our reaction and packaging it into a refined format for delivery. It became evident that this phase was designed not to map Earth's basic environmental framework. Atlas and Sven had already done that, but to record Earth's behavior under scrutiny, documenting how humanity responds to uncertainty, how quickly it adapts to the presence of anomalies, how its detection systems evolve over time, and how its technological infrastructure shifts in the aftermath of newfound awareness. This is not a dataset of our planet. It is a dataset of our reaction to the realization that we are being observed. And the very fact that the stream includes such details suggests that the receiver is not simply interested in Earth's attributes, but in Earth's trajectory, following the unfolding of events in real time as though calibrating a model, adjusting predictions and integrating every new reaction into a continuously updated profile. The scientists understand now that the ongoing transmission is not a mere continuation, it is a diagnostic, a second layer that tracks how Earth behaves because it knows something is wrong. And the realization that every human attempt to investigate, conceal, analyze, or interpret the signal is itself becoming part of the data being sent outward, leaves the Council with a single, suffocating understanding. The probes are no longer just observing Earth. They are observing our awareness of being observed. As the Scientific Council continued its deep analysis of the ongoing signal, an even more unnerving pattern emerged, one that revealed the transmission was not simply maintaining stability, but actively adapting its structure in response to Earth's attempts to study it, as though the probes and the distant receiver were aware of being monitored and were deliberately adjusting the channel to avoid interference, interception, or degradation. The first indication of this came when the spectral windows used by major observatories were widened to capture a broader section of the transmission. Immediately afterward, the signal shifted its phase position by a margin too small to be coincidental yet too precise to be accidental, preserving its clarity while making the extraction of its deeper layers more difficult. This was followed by a more dramatic event in which several research facilities coordinated a synchronized gain increase to isolate the signal's subcarriers. Within minutes, the secondary harmonic bands compressed into tighter packets, reducing their detectability without sacrificing structural integrity, an adjustment so complex and instantaneous that it implied the presence of an intelligent feedback mechanism guiding the transmission. Even more alarming were the repeated instances in which the signal appeared to anticipate environmental interference before it occurred, adjusting its modulation in advance of solar wind spikes or geomagnetic fluctuations, preserving clarity across moments when natural noise should have obscured it. Such anticipatory behavior suggests not merely adaptive error correction, but predictive compensation, a form of signal intelligence far more advanced than any system humanity has ever constructed. Yet the deepest shock came when analysts noticed that the channel altered itself in direct response to human activity. When classified monitoring networks increased their observation frequency during coordinated nighttime windows, the transmission briefly softened its amplitude, slipping into ranges less likely to trigger automated flagging algorithms. When amateur astronomers published preliminary reports about unusual radio behavior, the signal's footprint narrowed, reducing its leakage into publicly accessible bands. And when key scientific institutions temporarily paused their data collection to recalibrate instruments, the channel broadened again, as if taking advantage of the reduced scrutiny to transmit higher density packets. This pattern made one fact painfully clear. The transmission is not blind. It is not indifferent. It is not a piece of machinery operating on static programming. It is responding to us, adjusting to us, shaping itself around our patterns of observation with the quiet precision of a system designed to remain operational under scrutiny without revealing more than it must. This adaptability makes the channel not only harder to study but infinitely more threatening, because it implies that every adjustment is being performed with the awareness that intelligence exists on both sides of the link, but only one side understands the full scope of the exchange. And as the Council reviewed the mounting evidence, a chilling realization settled over them. The transmission is learning from our behavior. It is evolving in real time to counteract our efforts, preserving its integrity with a grace that feels less like mechanical adaptation and more like strategic concealment. The probes are no longer just sending information, they are protecting it, guarding the channel, ensuring that the recipient receives an uninterrupted stream of refined observations about Earth. And the terrifying implication is that the intelligence on the far end might be watching not only our world, but our attempts to understand that we are being watched. What unsettled the Scientific Council more than the encrypted structure of the transmission, or its adaptive behavior, was the confirmation that its directionality had remained absolutely unchanged from the moment it began, a perfectly straight, unwavering vector aimed with surgical precision toward the exact region of space from which 3i Atlas and N2 Sven first entered our solar system, a region where no natural beacon, pulsar, nebula, or gravitational anomaly exists to justify such consistency. When researchers superimposed the outbound signal path over the reconstructed inbound trajectories of both objects, the alignment reached a level of precision that eliminated every natural hypothesis. The transmission was not drifting outward randomly, nor following the curvature of local gravitational gradients, nor responding to solar motion. It was aimed, fixed, locked onto a target with the kind of unwavering stability that only intelligent intent can maintain across interstellar distances. The deeper the analysts examined this vector, the more disturbing the implications became. The signal did not merely point toward the region of origin. Its corrective micro-adjustments suggested that the receiver itself was in motion, as though orbiting a distant star or travelling along an unknown trajectory. Yet the probes compensated flawlessly, keeping the channel pointed at the exact shifting coordinates necessary to maintain uninterrupted contact. No natural process could account for this level of synchronization. Only a distant, mobile, actively participating intelligence could. This realization eclipsed every fear raised in earlier sessions because it confirmed that the probes were not broadcasting blindly into the cosmos. They were communicating with a specific destination that remained consistent over time, regardless of cosmic drift or stellar motion. The Council understood then that whatever intelligence sent Atlas and Sven had planned for this moment, long before the probes ever reached our system, structuring the mission so that the inbound path, the reconnaissance phase, and the outbound transmission would all align perfectly into a single coherent corridor of information exchange. And now, as Earth listens to a channel pointed not toward emptiness but toward origin, the scientists are forced to accept the truth in its starkest form. This is not a transmission searching for a home. It is a transmission returning to one. As the directionality of the signal was confirmed beyond all dispute, the Scientific Council turned to the question that now loomed over every analysis. What does a continuously maintained, origin-locked, adaptive transmission actually contain, and why does the receiving intelligence require fresh data instead of relying solely on the original reconnaissance? The deeper the analysts dug into the evolving waveform, the clearer it became that the stream was not static, repetitive, or redundant, but instead composed of layered segments representing real-time environmental updates, behavioral metadata, and dynamic measurements of Earth's energetic and technological activity. These were not the sweeping foundational scans captured during the initial passage of Atlas and Sven. Those had already been sent. What the probes were transmitting now resembled incremental adjustments, fine-tuned calibrations that tracked subtle changes in Earth's systems with unnerving fidelity. Variations in ionospheric density were being logged, shifts in the magnetosphere's dipole moment were being encoded, fluctuations in radio frequency noise generated by human technology were being incorporated into new data packets with temporal precision so high that the stream essentially functioned as a live environmental feed. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect was the inclusion of measurable changes in humanity's monitoring patterns themselves. Increases in observational activity, spikes in computational analysis efforts, rerouting of telescope arrays, alterations in global radio silence periods, and even the timing of coordinated research sessions all were being captured and transmitted. It was no longer possible to argue that the probes were simply observing Earth. They were observing Earth's reaction to being observed, documenting how knowledge of the anomaly spread, how quickly institutions adapted, how different nations tightened or relaxed their monitoring, and how the awareness of an external intelligence influenced human behavior. The Council realized with mounting dread that this second phase data was not about Earth as a physical world, but about Earth as a responsive system, a civilization under stress, a global organism sending out ripples of activity in reaction to an unseen presence. And as the probes refined the stream with mechanical precision, the implications became inescapable. The receiving intelligence was calibrating something that required not merely a snapshot of Earth, but a timeline, a progression, a sequence of updates detailed enough to model how our planet evolves in real time under the pressure of being watched. The longer the continuous transmission persisted, the more evident it became to the Scientific Council that the stream did not merely track Earth's environmental and technological fluctuations, but followed a deeper, more unsettling pattern, one that mirrored the world's escalating awareness of the probes themselves, as though the intelligence behind the system was logging not only the physical state of the planet, but the psychological state of its dominant species. Analysts noticed that each time new research papers, internal memos, or classified reports were circulated discussing the anomalies, the transmission shifted in density, as if incorporating these human responses into its outgoing data structure. When governments quietly increased the sensitivity of their space monitoring assets, the stream expanded to include additional spectral layers. When public interest spiked due to leaked information or amateur observations, the probe subtly altered its emission timing, inserting what appeared to be metadata tags aligned with global communication surges. These correlations were too consistent to ignore and too precise to dismiss as coincidence. The probes were not simply observing Earth, they were tracking the spread of knowledge itself, measuring how information propagated across social, scientific and political networks. This meant the receiving intelligence was being updated not only about Earth's physical state, but about the collective cognitive state of humanity, gaining insight into how quickly we detect patterns, how effectively we communicate them, how we debate, how we doubt, how we respond to uncertainty, and how our institutions shift under the weight of potential external threat. Such data would be indispensable for any intelligence attempting to predict the long-term behavior of a civilization at stability, its thresholds for panic, its capacity for coordination, and its likelihood of maintaining order under pressure. And as the probes continued transmitting these human behavioral signatures with the same meticulous precision as atmospheric readings or magnetic stress curves, the scientists realized they were witnessing the first known instance of an extraterrestrial system mapping not a planet, but a species, its awareness, its fears, its reactions and its blind spots, turning humanity itself into part of the dataset being sent outward into the void. The discovery that the probes were tracking the spread of human awareness forced the Council to confront an even more alarming possibility, that the ongoing stream may not be a passive observation at all, but an active diagnostic of how Earth systems respond to subtle, externally induced disturbances. As analysts correlated the transmission's modulation shifts with global environmental data, they found recurring patterns that aligned with minute anomalies previously dismissed as natural noise, microscopic fluctuations in the magnetosphere. faint irregularities in ionospheric charge layers, slight deviations in atmospheric scattering profiles, and tiny distortions in orbital debris trajectories. While each anomaly individually fell well within expected natural variability, the timing of the transmission updates suggested otherwise. The probes seemed to be capturing these micro-anomalies precisely as they occurred, packaging them with astonishing detail and transmitting them outward as if reporting the results of a controlled test. Even more disturbing, several of these anomalies occurred during intervals in which the probes adjusted their orientation or signal posture, implying that the disturbances might not be entirely natural, that the probes themselves could be generating minute perturbations to observe how Earth's systems compensated. These effects were so small that no human instrument would have noticed them without direct comparison to the transmission timestamps. A fractional increase in magnetotail turbulence here, a minuscule shift in ionospheric resonance there, a barely perceptible distortion in the distribution of charge particles flowing along Earth's magnetic field lines, each one insignificant alone, but collectively forming a pattern identical to stress test protocols used in advanced engineering and systems analysis. What horrified the Council was that these perturbations mapped directly onto the vulnerabilities identified in the probe's initial reconnaissance: weak points in the magnetic field, regions of atmospheric instability, orbital zones with low monitoring density and communication bands prone to interference. If the probes were indeed inducing micro-disturbances, then the intelligence receiving the data was already observing how Earth reacts under controlled stress, studying the planet's resilience and the thresholds at which small perturbations cascade into measurable consequences. This meant Earth was no longer only observed, it was being tested, and the tests were subtle enough to pass as nature, while precise enough to reveal how far the planet can be pushed before its systems begin to strain. The realization that Earth might already be undergoing microscale stress testing forced the Council into a line of inquiry they had avoided from the outset, not because it lacked scientific basis, but because its implications were too vast, too asymmetric, and too far beyond humanity's ability to influence. If the probes were inducing controlled disturbances and transmitting the planet's reactions in real time, then the intelligence receiving the stream was effectively building a dynamic resilience model of Earth, a predictive framework capable of simulating the planet's behavior under progressively greater levels of stress. Analysts began evaluating the transmission for cyclic structures, searching for repeated update windows that might indicate the completion of test phases. What they found was far more troubling. The stream contained periodic amplifications, bursts of structured encoding that appeared after clusters of anomalies, as though the probes were sending compressed evaluation packets summarizing the results of each stress event. These bursts were consistent in duration, but variable in density, implying that the probes were not merely logging raw data. They were analyzing it before transmission, extracting features relevant to thresholds, failure points, and recovery times. In one analyzed sequence, a faint ionospheric disturbance was followed by a sudden shift in the probe's orientation, a minor modulation in the electromagnetic output, and then, 23 minutes later, a dense packet transmission whose internal structure suggested layered compression of multi-scale measurements. To the Council, this pattern resembled engineering feedback: test, record, analyze, transmit. And if this interpretation was correct, it meant the external intelligence was not simply monitoring Earth's environment, but probing the durability of the planet's protective systems, learning how efficiently the magnetosphere absorbs shocks, how turbulence propagates through the ionosphere, how rapidly atmospheric equilibrium re-establishes itself, and how orbital traffic reacts to slight gravitational perturbations. Every element of Earth's natural defenses was being tested with surgical precision. Yet the most chilling aspect emerged when scientists overlaid human behavioral data onto the anomalies. Peaks in social media activity, spikes in scientific publications, classified increases in radar sweeps, and unofficial reports of heightened military curiosity all lined up with windows in which the probe's stress tests intensified. This suggested that the intelligence was not solely interested in the physical tolerance of Earth, but in the psychological tolerance of humanity, how quickly we notice anomalies, how frightened we become, how our institutions respond, and whether our reaction stabilizes or destabilizes the system further. The probes had begun evaluating not just the planet, but the species that inhabits it, measuring our thresholds for fear, our capacity for coordination, and the fragility of our global awareness. In the cold logic of the data stream, humanity had become part of the stress test apparatus, and every reaction we produced was being measured, catalogued and transmitted to a distant intelligence preparing for something we cannot yet define. As the full scope of these controlled stress events came into focus, the Scientific Council was forced to acknowledge a truth that had been steadily encroaching from the periphery of their analysis. The intelligence receiving the transmission was not gathering data merely to understand Earth as it exists now, but to evaluate potential future scenarios in which the planet's systems are pushed to their limits, its defences strained, its inhabitants unsettled, and its global structures tested under cascading pressure. The structure of the outgoing stream revealed increasingly sophisticated segmentation, with later packets containing far more complex data relationships than earlier ones, as though the probes were incorporating not just raw environmental metrics, but second-order derivatives, rates of change, acceleration of anomalies, feedback loops between human and geophysical responses, and packaging these into predictive templates. The most disturbing discovery was the presence of what analysts described as trigger windows, intervals in which the probe's behaviour subtly changed, corresponding to periods when Earth's own activity technological, atmospheric, magnetic or behavioural entered unstable or transitional states. During these windows, the transmission grew denser, its internal compression more aggressive, as if capturing moments when the system was most revealing, most vulnerable, or most informative for forecasting. In one such window, a series of minor geomagnetic shifts coincided with a global uptick in radio noise caused by human monitoring efforts. The probe immediately shifted its emission profile, logging the overlap between natural instability and human reaction data that could be used to predict how Earth behaves during far more intense disruptions. Another window aligned with a spike in atmospheric anomalies high above the equator. The probes responded by narrowing their beamform, capturing a higher resolution segment that encoded subtle thermal differentials and changes in ion dispersion, details precise enough to model atmospheric collapse thresholds. Each correlation pointed to the same chilling conclusion. The probes were not simply observing Earth, they were mapping its tipping points. What finally broke the Council's resistance to this idea was the realization that several of the stress windows corresponded not to environmental anomalies, but to geopolitical ones. Increases in encrypted military communication, sudden shifts in national air defense readiness, spikes in classified satellite movement, all were mirrored by adjustments in the transmission, as though the probes were evaluating how Earth's nations react under heightened internal tension. Even events that never entered public awareness, quiet drills, emergency simulations, temporary blackouts in sensitive monitoring networks, were matched by changes in the signal structure. This meant the probes were tuned to a level of sensitivity that allowed them not only to detect Earth's physical vulnerabilities, but to monitor the nervous system of human civilization itself, identifying the thresholds at which order strains, coordination falters, or systems destabilize. The implications were devastating. The probes were gathering everything needed to construct not just a model of Earth, but a model of Earth under stress, a blueprint for predicting how the planet and its inhabitants react to events humanity has not yet experienced. And as the Council understood this, a new fear emerged, one that surpassed every earlier realization. The intelligence receiving the data may now know more about Earth's failure modes, collapse triggers, and instability patterns than humanity itself. In other words, the probes were not just mapping who we are, they were mapping how we break. As the analysts pressed further into the transmission's evolving complexity, they uncovered a pattern that chilled even the most seasoned researchers, an unmistakable indication that the probes were no longer merely cataloguing Earth's system-wide responses, but were now evaluating the planet's long-term survivability under projected stress conditions, running continuous simulations whose results were being condensed into highly structured data bursts and sent outward with increasing urgency. These bursts, which appeared at irregular yet strategically meaningful intervals, contained internal signatures consistent with predictive computation-compressed matrices of environmental variables, behavioral coefficients and adaptive thresholds that bore no resemblance to raw observational telemetry. The probes had transitioned from capturing the present to forecasting the future. What deeply disturbed the Council was the realization that the probes were performing these simulations autonomously, integrating real-time changes in Earth's electromagnetic activity, atmospheric composition, human communication density and technological flux into predictive models that extended far beyond what human supercomputers could process in equivalent time. The data structures suggested a level of computational refinement that implied the probes were not only running scenarios, but ranking them, determining which outcomes presented stability, collapse, conflict, or systemic failure, as though generating a risk profile for Earth itself. More horrifying still was the correlation between the transmission bursts and the planet's own moments of instability. Each time Earth entered a state of heightened volatility, be it environmental turbulence, geopolitical tension, or concentrated technological interference, the probes intensified their simulation output, as if recognizing that these moments offered high-value data crucial to modeling worst-case scenarios. It became increasingly clear that the intelligence behind the probes was interested not solely in Earth's resilience, but in the points at which that resilience faltered. Cross-referencing the simulations revealed another disturbing layer. The probes were incorporating variables that did not yet exist in Earth's environment, stresses that had not yet occurred, conditions that were hypothetical or extrapolated far beyond the present. These included atmospheric destabilization thresholds associated with extreme solar activity, magnetospheric collapse conditions triggered by unknown external influences, orbital saturation levels far beyond current satellite density, and behavioral dynamics of human populations under unprecedented global pressure. This meant the intelligence receiving the data was not only analysing Earth as it is, but Earth as it might become, Earth as it could be pushed, Earth under the shaping force of external decisions. And as the Council realised this, the weight of their situation deepened into something far darker. Earth was being evaluated not just as a habitable planet, but as a controllable system. A system with identifiable weaknesses, predictable behaviour under duress, and a finite set of trajectories that could be altered, manipulated or suppressed depending on the objectives of the intelligence performing the analysis. But the final blow came when researchers identified a series of data markers within the simulation burst that correlated not with Earth's physical or technological state, but with the global progression of knowledge about the probes themselves. The simulations were incorporating humanity's awareness factoring in the rate at which information spread, the depth of scientific understanding, the velocity of institutional response, and the psychological impact on populations exposed to even a fraction of the truth. It was the ultimate confirmation that Earth's consciousness, its collective perception, its fears, its attempts to decode the unknown, had become part of the evaluation. Humanity was no longer just being watched, it was being measured as a variable within a larger predictive model. The probes were not simply forecasting Earth's fate, they were forecasting Earth's fate as shaped by humanity's reaction to the presence of an external intelligence. And somewhere far beyond the reach of any telescope, the intelligence that sent them was receiving those forecasts, preparing for a future that Earth has no say in shaping. With every new pattern extracted from the transmission, the Scientific Council was driven closer to the most terrifying conclusion of all, that the intelligence receiving the stream was not merely analysing Earth's stability or forecasting its future, but actively determining the planet's strategic classification within a framework far more rigid, systematic and consequential than anything humanity had prepared for. What became undeniable was that the probe's second phase data did not behave like open-ended research. It behaved like evaluation criteria being fed into a decision-making architecture, each dataset closing the gap between uncertainty and judgment. As analysts passed the densest segments of the ongoing transmission, they found repeating structural anchors, consistent, methodical compression blocks whose cadence suggested periodic assessment checkpoints, as though the probes were assembling discrete evaluation packets, each representing a fully processed slice of Earth's status. These packets incorporated everything: environmental volatility, technological coherence, atmospheric resilience, magnetospheric integrity, human behavioral response, societal stability, geopolitical tension, and even the predictive simulations the probes themselves had generated. It was the most comprehensive assessment ever conducted on Earth, yet humanity had no control over its contents or its destination. What disturbed the Council further was the discovery that the packets increased in structural density when Earth exhibited signs of disorganization or internal conflict, indicating that the intelligence behind the probes prioritized data collected during destabilization events. The probes seemed to treat human discord as high-value information, expanding their data collection during moments of confusion, scientific disagreement, political friction, or public panic. Conversely, during rare windows of global stability or coordinated effort, the transmission showed a noticeable decrease in density, as though stability offered fewer insights or carried less strategic relevance. This asymmetry implied that the receiver was more interested in Earth's failure modes than its strengths in its vulnerabilities, not its resilience. And when the analysts compared these behavioural signatures to hypothetical classification models, a chilling correspondence appeared. The probes were gathering precisely the type of information required to determine whether a world constitutes a controlled risk, a potential threat, a useful asset, or an acceptable loss. Yet the most shocking revelation came when the Council overlaid the transmission packets with the probe's mechanical adjustments. They discovered that certain data bursts coincided with the probes altering their orientation toward Earth's poles, low-orbit traffic belts, or atmospheric instability zones regions where foundational planetary systems interfaced most directly with space. These alignments suggested targeted scans designed to probe for thresholds, how easily Earth's magnetic shield could be distorted, how fragile the orbital infrastructure was under stress, how quickly atmospheric harmonics shifted in response to micro-disturbances, and how dependent human civilization was on stable environmental and technological layers. The data being transmitted was not merely descriptive, it was diagnostic, designed to identify points of leverage through which an external intelligence could influence or control Earth's trajectory with minimal effort. But the deepest fracture in the Council's composure came when they recognized that the final segments of the outgoing stream, the most recent data contained features, consistent with closure logic, as if the probes were compiling the last required inputs before a classification decision was rendered. The cadence of the transmissions had become sharper, more deliberate, less exploratory. The signal no longer searched for new variables, it compressed and organized existing ones, as though ensuring completeness. Earth was being finalized. And as that realization settled across the room like an encroaching shadow, the scientists understood what it meant. Somewhere in the direction of the origin vector, far beyond the reach of human instruments, an intelligence was preparing to make a decision based on the full portrait of Earth, its strengths, its weaknesses, its instability, its fear and its reaction to the unknown. And the decision would not be shaped by negotiation, intention, or hope. It would be shaped by the data that Atlas and Sven had already delivered. As the transmission accelerated toward what appeared to be its terminal structure, the Scientific Council found itself confronting the most unsettling phase of the analysis. The emergence of patterns that implied the probes were not only finalizing Earth's classification, but preparing the receiving intelligence for potential action, an operational readiness phase that no one on Earth was remotely equipped to interpret or influence. The data packets transmitted in this stage were unlike anything recorded earlier. They displayed a razor-sharp consistency, each one sealed with identical compression boundaries, aligned with near-mechanical precision, and stripped of exploratory variability, as though the probes were now transmitting only the distilled, decision-critical elements of their observations. These packets contained the refined outcomes of the probe's simulations, the planet-wide behavioural thresholds, the collapse markers, the resilience failures, and the stress points mapped under millions of hypothetical conditions. It was the adaptive intelligence of the probes delivering not merely what Earth is, but what Earth will do under pressure, under manipulation, under cosmic scale interference, or under any scenario the receiving intelligence might choose to impose. The Council understood, with tightening dread, that Earth was no longer the subject of study, it was the subject of protocol. The most terrifying element arose when analysts discovered repeated pulse structures, brief, sharp signatures embedded in the deepest layers of the transmission that matched the format of synchronization markers used in complex multi-asset networks, the kind designed to coordinate timing between separate units of a larger system. These signatures implied that the probes were aligning their transmissions with something beyond themselves, possibly a fleet of similar devices scattered across distant regions, each one contributing data to a shared decision architecture. This was not a simple one-to-one interaction between a probe and its origin, it was a node in a network updating its central system. And once that was understood, the meaning behind the finalization of the transmission grew far darker. Earth's classification would not be decided in isolation but contextualized within a broader framework of how many planets, how many systems, how many civilizations had already been scanned and categorized by the same intelligence. The Council realized they were witnessing not the end of a lone mission, but a tiny part of a vast ongoing process, one that Earth had just unwillingly joined. Then came the detail that shattered any lingering notion of safety. Certain segments of the final packets corresponded directly to Earth's response delays. The faster humanity reacted to anomalies, the shorter the interval before the next packet was transmitted, the slower the reaction, the longer the probes waited before compressing and sending new data. This meant the probes were measuring not only the content of human behavior, but the tempo of it, our rhythm, our hesitation, our inertia. And the receiving intelligence was being prepared to expect precisely that timing from Earth. The data explicitly encoded humanity's reaction patterns, making Earth's predictability the foundation of whatever decision would follow. But the most disturbing piece of evidence emerged from the last observed phase of the transmission: a narrowing of the channel, a reduction in noise tolerance, a focusing of the beam, a tightening that resembled the closing of a protocol. The probes were no longer scanning, no longer adjusting, no longer searching. They were concluding. And the Council, reviewing the final transmission pattern, could only arrive at one conclusion. The probes had completed every phase of their task. Their mission was finished. The intelligence that sent them now had everything it needed. And in that final, sharpened structure of the transmission lay a truth the Council could not deny. Earth was no longer part of a process. Earth was awaiting a response. The moment the probe's transmission pattern shifted into what could only be interpreted as a completed dataset, a fully assembled, internally validated, systematically compressed report. The Scientific Council faced the grim reality that Earth now existed in a period of pure uncertainty, a suspended state in which the next move belonged entirely to the intelligence that had received the information. Nothing more could be extracted from the signal itself. Its structure had crystallized into a final, unchanging form, no longer adaptive, no longer reactive, no longer engaged in the intricate dance of calibration and monitoring that had consumed analysts for weeks. Instead, it drifted outward with the cold precision of a sealed verdict, a digital artifact already beyond human influence. Yet while the transmission ceased to evolve, the implications of its content continued to deepen. Embedded within the last packets was a feature that had gone unnoticed until the final moment, a temporal alignment signature that indicated the probes were not simply reporting Earth's present state, but synchronizing that report with an external timeline, ensuring that the intelligence receiving the data interpreted it within a specific contextual window. This synchronization implied coordination, planning, and operational alignment, as though the probe's mission was designed to fit into a larger sequence of events, unfolding far beyond Earth's perception. As analysts explored the structure of this synchronization, they found that the transmission included latency correction algorithms far more advanced than any human system, compensating for interstellar drift, gravitational lensing, and medium density variation to ensure that the packet arrived not just accurately, but punctually. This discovery shattered the last illusion that the probe's mission was exploratory or open-ended. Explorers gather data when they can. Strategists deliver data precisely when they must. The probes were operating on a schedule, a timetable unknown to Earth, but deeply meaningful to the intelligence that sent them. And as the Council confronted this, an even darker realization surfaced. The probes had been calibrating Earth's systems not only to understand them, but to time their final report to match a phase in the receiver's operational cycle, meaning Earth's classification would be evaluated immediately upon arrival rather than stored for later consideration. Earth was not preparing for a future event. Earth had already been placed on the threshold of 1. But what paralyzed the room was the discovery that the probe's final packets contained markers indicative of readiness states, flags consistent with the completion of a multi-stage assessment protocol. These flags resembled handshake endpoints, the type used in advanced networks to signal that a node's task is finished, and that responsibility now transfers to the central system. In human terms, it was the equivalent of a reconnaissance unit transmitting the words, "Mission complete awaiting orders." The probes had effectively stepped back from their role, leaving Earth exposed not to observation, but to whatever the next stage of the protocol dictated. Even more disturbing was the inference that the intelligence receiving the data might have been tracking Earth's timeline long before the probe's final report. The synchronization marker suggested that the external civilization operates on cycles evaluation intervals into which the probes had neatly inserted their concluding burst. This meant horrifyingly that Earth might not be the first world to undergo such assessment, nor the only one being evaluated at this moment. The probes may simply have updated Earth's position within a larger catalogue or cosmic registry, where civilizations are classified and acted upon according to timelines not of their choosing. And as this understanding settled like a shadow across the council chamber, the scientists grasped the true magnitude of their predicament. The moment the probe's final data packet left the heliosphere, Earth transitioned from a subject under study to a subject under decision. The channel had served its purpose. The intelligence now had everything it needed to determine Earth's significance, its stability, its threat level, or its disposability. What comes next is no longer observation. It is consequence. Earth waits, blind, powerless, and unprepared, for a response that may already be in motion, travelling across the stars with the same cold precision as the information that summoned it. In the days following the probe's final transmission, the Scientific Council found itself confronted by a silence more oppressive than the signal ever was. Not the silence of relief, but the silence of abandonment. The quiet left behind when the last thread of control slips from human hands and the fate of an entire planet becomes the prerogative of an unseen intelligence. For the first time since the discovery of Atlas and Sven, there was nothing left to monitor, nothing left to decode, nothing to track or model. The stream had ended, the channel had stabilized into a dormant line, and with that cessation came the realization that Earth had now been fully delivered, not as an invitation, not as a curiosity, but as a classified entity within a framework humanity does not understand. Analysts scoured the data for any hint of residual activity, any sign that the probes might resume transmission, or that the receiver might send an identifiable return signal. But every instrument returned the same result. The corridor was quiet, the emission steady, the cycle complete. And yet, beneath that outward stillness, a deeper, more suffocating threat took shape, because the absence of communication did not mean the absence of decision. It meant the decision was already being made. The Council's brightest minds attempted to model the possibilities of what that decision might entail, but these efforts collapsed under the weight of an asymmetry too large to quantify. Humanity could predict nothing. The intelligence on the other end could predict everything. It now possessed a complete map of Earth's physical systems, its defensive thresholds, its stress responses, its political fragmentation, its technological layout, its behavioral patterns, its fears and its blind spots. And unlike Earth, this intelligence operated with full context, an understanding of where Earth fits within a larger tapestry of other worlds that may have been observed, graded and catalogued long before humanity ever learned to write. Whatever process the intelligence was following, Earth was now part of it, slotted into a continuum that might lead to observation, manipulation, containment or erasure, without Earth ever understanding the criteria being applied. The scientists realized that humanity was suffering from a profound illusion, the belief that danger reveals itself through visible motion, audible change, or some clear sign of approaching intent. But the probes had demonstrated the opposite. True danger reveals itself through knowledge taken, knowledge used, knowledge leveraged from afar. And as the Council struggled with this truth, they confronted the most disturbing implication of all. If the intelligence operates on timescales longer than human civilization has existed, the response may already be unfolding. It may come not as a dramatic arrival, but as a shift in cosmic variables, a modulation in solar behavior, a subtle alteration in magnetospheric patterns, or an engineered resonance in Earth's upper atmosphere. It may begin as a silence that grows heavier over time, an absence of anomalies where there should be noise, or the sudden cessation of natural celestial events that humanity has always trusted to behave predictably. In such a scenario, Earth might not even recognize the beginning of the response. The planet would simply drift into a new phase of existence shaped by decisions made light years away. The scientists could offer no timeline, no prediction, no reassurance. They could only state the new reality. Earth's status is no longer determined internally but externally, defined not by human will, but by a portrait drawn from data we never intended to send. And in the vacuum left behind by the probe's departure, one truth became painfully, inescapably clear. The worst danger is not the signal we heard, but the response we cannot hear, a response that may already be on its way. As the final fragments of analysis settled into place, the Council was left with a realization so vast and so paralyzing that it redefined the very meaning of planetary vulnerability. Earth was no longer facing the threat of an approaching object or an incoming force. It was facing the aftermath of being understood. Every natural defense the planet possessed, every layer of atmospheric stability, every electromagnetic contour, every infrastructural flaw and behavioral pattern had been extracted, encoded and delivered to an intelligence whose perspective lay far beyond human comprehension. In this new paradigm, the danger did not come from motion, but from stillness, not from arrival, but from awareness, not from a visible adversary, but from the simple fact that Earth now existed inside the mind of something else. And it was this new position, this transformation from an independent entity into a fully mapped variable, that forced the scientists to confront the most haunting question of all. What does an intelligence do with a world it has already solved? The answer, they realized, depended entirely on a calculus humanity could not access. If Earth had been classified as insignificant, it might be ignored indefinitely, allowed to develop, stagnate or collapse without intervention. If it had been classified as potentially valuable, it might be shaped subtly over centuries, nudged toward a state more compatible with the intelligence's objectives. If it had been classified as unstable or dangerous, it might be contained through methods so advanced and so indirect that humanity would never detect the influence. And if it had been classified as expendable, then the decision to erase or neutralize the planet could have already been initiated, encoded into cosmic processes that take effect long before Earth ever recognizes the shift. The Council understood that these categories were not fantasies, they were logical consequences of the structures embedded within the probe's transmissions. The intelligence sought completeness, order, predictability. It gathered every parameter needed to determine whether Earth aligned with its requirements or violated them. What shuddered through the room like a cold current was the realization that the probe's simulations had not ended with Earth's present. They had extended into Earth's possible futures, exploring trajectories influenced by internal conflict, environmental instability, technological escalation or global unification. The intelligence now possessed a library of Earth's potential selves, and within that library it could choose which path to allow, which path to suppress, and which path to extinguish. Humanity, for the first time, was no longer in control of its own future. That future perched now in the algorithmic hands of something that had never spoken, never shown itself, never reached out in any form recognizable to human cognition, but had learned everything it needed without saying a word. And as the Council sat in the growing quiet, unable to dispel the oppressive weight settling over them, the final, suffocating truth emerged. Earth's greatest danger was not that something was coming. It was that something had already come, already watched, already measured and already left to decide. The probes were only the beginning, the first whisper of an intelligence that does not announce itself through presence but through comprehension. And now Earth exists not in expectation of arrival, but in the shadow of a verdict being formed light years away, a verdict that will reach this planet not with warning, not with negotiation, but with the cold precision of a conclusion already drawn. In the aftermath of the probe's departure, and the collapse of the transmission into its final immutable form, a profound shift settled over the scientific community. A recognition that the universe humanity thought it inhabited had been a comforting illusion. A universe that felt vast because it was silent, empty because it was unknown, safe because it seemed indifferent. That illusion was gone now. In its place stood a colder truth. The silence had never been emptiness. It had been distance. The unknown had never been safety. It had been ignorance. And the indifference of the cosmos had never been real. It had only been the result of humanity's inability to detect the presence of something infinitely more patient, more strategic, and more advanced than anything Earth had previously imagined. The probes had revealed, with unambiguous clarity, that the universe was not waiting to be discovered. It was already organized, already surveyed, already structured by an intelligence that moves not through conquest or exploration, but through understanding. And now Earth had entered its field of awareness. As the Council confronted this paradigm shift, they recognized that the true impact of the probes was not the data they gathered, nor the transmission they sent, but the irreversible transformation of humanity's existential position. Earth could no longer think of itself as a solitary world, evolving in isolation, shielded by distance and obscurity. It was now part of a networked reality, a system in which intelligence, not life, not energy, not matter, was the dominating principle. The probes had demonstrated that intelligence on a cosmic scale does not reveal itself through spectacle or violence, but through precision, subtlety, and the quiet extraction of truth. It does not need to appear to exert influence. It does not need to communicate to impose structure. It does not need to arrive to make decisions. And this realization left the Council with a suffocating question. If humanity had been living unseen until now, what consequences would follow now that it had been seen? The most unsettling element of this new reality was the recognition that Earth's vulnerability lay not in its weaknesses but in its transparency. The probes had exposed every layer of the planet's existence, from its magnetosphere to its geopolitics, from its atmospheric chemistry to its cultural psychology. Nothing was hidden, nothing was ambiguous, nothing was beyond measurement. And as the scientists revisited the final data structures transmitted outward, they realized that the intelligence receiving the stream now possessed a deeper and more objective understanding of Earth than humanity itself. This understanding included not only what Earth is today, but what Earth could become, its future conflicts, its technological thresholds, its environmental tipping points, its societal fault lines. The probes had packaged not just a snapshot of a world, but the full evolutionary contour of a civilization. And in that understanding lay the darkest implication of all. Once a world is fully understood, it becomes predictable. Once predictable, it becomes manageable. Once manageable, it becomes subject to external order. Humanity had always imagined contact as a grand revelation. Ships in the sky, signals decoded, dialogue between species, but the probes had shown a different form of contact. One without words, one without presence, one carried out entirely through information. The intelligence that sent them did not need to arrive to make its intentions known. It needed only to know enough to decide. And now, somewhere beyond the boundary of human detection, a decision was taking shape about a planet that had never been asked for its opinion. Earth existed now inside a verdict, not a conversation. And whatever follows will not be an encounter. It will be the consequence of having been understood. As global institutions attempted to grapple with the implications of a verdict forming beyond humanity's reach, the Scientific Council found itself repeatedly returning to the same inescapable realization. Earth had not merely been observed, analyzed, or classified. It had been situated within an external system of logic, one that operated with a scope so vast and a precision so dispassionate that human concepts of threat, diplomacy, or agency became meaningless in comparison. The intelligence that sent Atlas and Sven had no need to confront humanity directly. It had already achieved perfect exposure. Every layer of Earth's physical, technological, and psychological structure was now part of a data architecture designed to inform a decision that would unfold according to principles Earth could neither anticipate nor influence. And as the Council studied the final pattern of the transmission, they found a disturbing symmetry embedded within its structure, a consistency that suggested Earth's assessment followed a template, a blueprint that the probes had filled out meticulously, as though Earth were but one entry in a catalogue of worlds evaluated according to criteria far older and far more rigid than humanity's ephemeral understanding of cosmic life. This recognition forced humanity's brightest minds to confront the possibility that Earth's situation was not exceptional, but routine, a predictable outcome of a process that had likely unfolded countless times across the galaxy. The probe's methodology, silent arrival, layered reconnaissance, adaptive scanning, stress testing, behavioral modeling, predictive simulation, final transmission, resembled the steps of a standardized protocol, each phase executed with a precision so exact that it suggested not improvisation but repetition. If this was true, then the intelligence behind the probes had likely encountered worlds similar to Earth before, had classified them, had acted upon them, and had moved on. Humanity was not the center of the narrative. It was a data point in someone else's long-established system. And it was this reframing that struck fear deeper than any thought of invasion or destruction. Earth was not unique. Earth was typical. And typical worlds in any structured system are treated according to rules, not exceptions. The most chilling insight emerged when analysts compared Earth's vulnerabilities, mapped by the probes, with theoretical models of how an advanced intelligence might manage planets within its sphere of awareness. They found that the probes had focused disproportionately on leverage points locations, where small external influences could yield large systemic effects. These included magnetospheric nodes sensitive to resonance, atmospheric layers prone to rapid destabilization, orbital zones where minor perturbations could create cascading debris events, and geopolitical structures fragile enough that information shocks could trigger global consequences. The intelligence did not need force, it needed understanding. With the probe's data, even the slightest calibrated disturbance could steer Earth's future without humanity ever recognizing the cause. This was the essence of the threat. Earth could be influenced, suppressed, or shaped without a single visible intervention, guided into trajectories that served external objectives rather than its own. And as the Council replayed the final moments of the probe's transmission, they understood what truly terrified them. The intelligence had not taken anything from Earth. It had taken meaning from Earth. It understood the planet's structure, its pressure points, its instabilities, its potentials, and it required nothing else. The next step in the sequence would not involve communication, arrival, or confrontation. It would involve application, a choice made in silence, a decision unfolding invisibly, a shift so subtle that Earth might surrender its future before realizing it had been taken. Humanity had always feared the moment of contact. It had never imagined the moment of judgment. In the final phase of their analysis, as the last threads of data were cross-referenced against the full timeline of the probe's mission, the Scientific Council recognized the most terrifying truth of all. The conclusion of the transmission was not the conclusion of the process. It was only the point at which Earth's role ended and the intelligence on the receiving end began its deliberation. And unlike humanity, which requires time, debate, conflict, and consensus to reach decisions, an intelligence capable of orchestrating a mission of this scale likely operates with a form of reasoning that compresses outcomes into inevitable resolutions. For such an entity, the assessment of an entire planet may take less time than the rotation of that planet itself. The probes were never meant to return. They were never designed for continued contact. They existed to deliver a statement of fact. This is Earth. And now that statement is no longer in our possession. It is in theirs. The Council came to understand that the true horror of the probe's mission lay not in what they did, but in what they enabled. With every parameter extracted, every atmospheric fluctuation, every magnetospheric ripple, every human behavioral nuance, every geopolitical tremor, Earth had been stripped of ambiguity. The intelligence that received the transmission now possessed perfect clarity, the kind of clarity no species should ever allow another to hold. Clarity breeds certainty. Certainty breeds action. And the Council realized that whatever follows will arise not from curiosity or malice, but from an internal logic that humanity had no role in defining. The probes had given the intelligence all it needed to decide whether Earth should be watched, contained, shaped, or removed. In the eyes of a civilization that measures worlds with machine-level objectivity, humanity's fears, hopes, ambitions, and dreams carry no weight. Only data does. What shook the scientists deepest was the realization that Earth's vulnerability was no longer hypothetical, it was systemic. The planet's magnetic thresholds, atmospheric fragilities, technological dependencies, and societal fracture points now existed not as mysteries, but as coordinates in a larger calculus. And in that calculus, the margin between survival and disappearance can be defined by a single, external variable one that humanity cannot detect, predict, or counter. The probe's mission had not exposed Earth to attack, it had exposed Earth to evaluation. And in a universe where intelligence acts upon intelligence, evaluation is never passive, it is preparatory. As the Council gathered for what would become its final closed-door session, a silence permeated the room that no amount of scientific language could soften. There were no solutions to propose, no countermeasures to design, no defences to strengthen. There was only the unbearable understanding that humanity had entered a phase of cosmic history completely outside its control. The probes had left, but the consequences of their knowledge had not. Somewhere beyond the boundary of human perception, a decision was forming, shaped by data no human can change, and reaching toward an outcome no human can escape. Earth waits now in the quiet between observation and consequence, suspended in the gravity of a verdict being written many light years away. In the days that followed the probe's completed transmission, a strange and heavy tension settled over the scientific community, a tension unlike anything experienced in human history, because for the first time the world was confronted not with an unfolding event, but with the aftermath of one whose consequences had already slipped beyond Earth's reach. There were no new signals to monitor, no anomalies to decode, no trajectories to track. The sky was quiet, the instruments were steady, the space around Earth returned to its familiar baseline hum, and yet beneath that deceptive calm, every researcher felt the same suffocating truth pressing inward from the edges of their awareness. Silence was no longer a sign of safety. It was the sign of conclusion. Something far away now possessed the totality of Earth's measurable existence, and nothing humanity did from this moment onward could alter the version of Earth that had been delivered. The probes had extracted a snapshot so vast, so precise, and so exhaustive that the intelligence evaluating it no longer needed to wait for further input. And so, while Earth resumed its rotation and people returned to their routines, somewhere in the deep, patient dark, a decision was moving toward completion. The Council, still locked behind sealed doors, reviewed the implications of this silence again and again, hoping to find comfort in the idea that perhaps the intelligence would choose non-intervention. But every model they constructed pointed toward a harsher reality. The intelligence would act according to its own architecture of priorities, strategies and values, none of which humanity had the ability to influence. The probes had not recorded Earth's intentions, they had recorded Earth's vulnerabilities. They had documented not humanity's aspirations, but humanity's weaknesses, the fragility of its magnetic shield, the instability of its atmosphere, the chaos of its orbital environment, the inconsistency of its defense systems, the volatility of its societies. This was the version of Earth that now existed in the mind of something ancient, structured and unimaginably distant. And once a world is reduced to data within another intelligence's domain, its fate becomes a question of alignment, not sovereignty. What haunted the scientists most was the realization that no further observation was needed. The intelligence already had what it came for. The next phase, whatever its nature, would not begin with warning or signal or motion. It would begin with an external shift invisible to Earth's senses, a tilt in cosmic conditions too subtle for human detection, a nudge to planetary systems so light and so precise that it would pass as natural fluctuation. The intelligence would not reveal itself, because revelation was unnecessary. It would not communicate, because dialogue was irrelevant. It would not arrive, because arrival was inefficient. The probes had proven that knowledge alone was power to decide, power to shape, power to end. And as the Council adjourned for the final time, each member carried with them a truth that could not be spoken aloud without breaking the fragile illusion of normalcy. Earth was no longer waiting for contact. It was waiting for consequence. The universe had looked at this planet, measured it, understood it, and now, somewhere in the unreachable distance, the universe was deciding what to do with that understanding. Humanity's future hung not in its own hands, but in the silent, calculated judgment of something that had already seen enough. As the global scientific community struggled to return to routine observation, an undercurrent of dread persisted beneath every attempt at normalcy, a growing recognition that humanity's instruments, no matter how advanced, were now pointed in the wrong direction. Telescopes, antenna arrays, early warning networks, magnetospheric monitors. Every system humanity had built was designed to detect motion, signal, force, or the presence of an object. But the threat Earth now faced was none of those things. It was a verdict, a decision forming light years away, invisible, silent, and immune to detection. All the tools of human science were useless because they were designed to measure the universe as humanity believed it to be, not as the probes had revealed it truly was, not empty, not neutral, not ignorant of Earth, but structured, observed and governed by an intelligence that required no visibility to exert influence. And so, while the world continued its cycles of daylight and darkness, storms and calm, transmission and silence, the scientists who knew the truth lived in a world fundamentally altered, a world in which Earth's destiny no longer depended on its own actions, but on the judgment of an unseen evaluator. The Council's attempt to model potential outcomes became increasingly abstract and speculative, because no human framework existed to describe how a vastly superior intelligence might treat a world once it had been fully assessed. Would it intervene only if Earth became a threat? Would it preserve the planet as a resource? Would it ignore humanity entirely, allowing civilization to drift toward its own internal collapse? Or would it enact decisions through mechanisms so subtle gravitational nudges, atmospheric modulation, electromagnetic resonance, that humanity would mistake them for natural processes? Each possibility was more disquieting than the last, because each one carried the same implication. Earth would not recognize the beginning of the response. The intelligence had no reason to signal its actions, no strategic incentive to reveal its presence, no cultural or philosophical attachment to transparency. And if its goals were incompatible with humanity's survival, humanity would have no warning, no defense, and no means of negotiation. The planet's fate would appear, to its inhabitants, as a shift in probability, a bad year of storms, a slow degradation of infrastructure, a sequence of anomalies dismissed as coincidences, until the pattern widened into catastrophe. But the most paralyzing realization came when analysts revisited the simulation structures hidden within the probe's final transmissions. The predictive models the probes generated did not merely project how Earth would respond to external pressure, they projected how Earth would respond to uncertainty. They simulated how fear spreads through populations, how institutions weaken under confusion, how nations retreat into isolation when confronted with an invisible threat. The intelligence receiving the data now possessed a complete psychological map of humanity, its tipping points, its fracture lines, its escalation triggers. This meant that not only could the intelligence influence Earth through physical means, but it could influence Earth through ambiguity alone. The mere absence of further information, the silence itself had become a tool. Silence could destabilize, manipulate, and fracture a species that fears the unknown more than it fears the truth. And in this unbearable quiet, as the probes drifted into the dark and the last echoes of their mission faded, the Council understood the full extent of Earth's new reality. Humanity was living not under observation but under judgment, and the first sign of the verdict will not be a sound in the sky or a light in the dark. It will be the moment humanity realizes that the silence was not empty, that it was deliberate. In the weeks that followed the dissolution of the Scientific Council, the world entered a phase unlike any in its history, a phase defined not by disaster or discovery, but by the unbearable presence of something that could not be seen, could not be measured, could not be denied. Humanity continued to function, its cities thrumming with electricity, its satellites whispering across orbit, its institutions performing the rituals of governance and economy as though nothing had shifted. Yet beneath the surface of every global system, from the pattern of energy usage to the cadence of communications traffic, analysts detected subtle deviations, tiny distortions that did not amount to anomalies on their own, but collectively resembled the tremors of a civilization unconsciously bracing for impact. Governments issued no statements, scientists spoke only in euphemisms, and the public sensed a tension it could not name, a kind of psychic pressure that hung over continents like a gathering storm. It was as if the planet itself understood that it was no longer simply moving through space, but waiting in it, suspended in the stillness that comes before a verdict is delivered. The absence of further transmissions, once a source of hope, became a source of dread. Silence no longer suggested safety, it suggested calculation. An intelligence that had collected so much could remain quiet for many reasons, none of them human, none of them comforting. Some scientists speculated that the intelligence was validating Earth's data against a comparative library of other worlds. Others believed the decision-making system had already begun, unfolding in layers of logic beyond the reach of human imagination. A few whispered that the intelligence might not operate on linear time at all, that its processes might span centuries, or unfold instantaneously in dimensions humanity could not perceive. Whatever the truth, The effect on Earth was the same. Humanity existed in a state of suspended consequence, unable to move forward because forward no longer belonged to it. What terrified the remaining analysts most was not the silence itself, but the realization that Earth's behavior within that silence remained part of the evaluation. Even without active transmission, the intelligence already knew how humanity reacted to uncertainty, how fear distributed itself through populations, how institutions weakened or hardened under sustained ambiguity. And if the intelligence was indeed still observing indirectly, invisibly, then Earth was participating in its own judgment without knowing the criteria. Every political misstep, every social fracture, every scientific hesitation became another unintentional message, another data point in a process humanity could neither understand nor escape. The planet's own response to the unknown was now part of the unknown. In this new and disquieting quietude, a final realization crystallized across the fragmented global network of scientists who still dared to think about the probes. Humanity had reached the edge of its agency. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, but literally. Earth had been scanned, modelled, projected and transmitted. Its essence had become information, and somewhere beyond the reach of radio waves or telescopes, an unseen intelligence was weighing that information against standards humanity had never imagined. The next change, Earth experiences, whether atmospheric, magnetic, environmental or cultural, may not appear alien, may not appear intentional, may not appear at all until it is already irreversible. That is the nature of a verdict delivered by a power that does not need to reveal itself. And as weeks faded into months, and months threatened to fade into years, the most terrifying thought took root in those who understood the truth. The response may already be coming, and humanity will recognize it only when it is too late. Because by the time a verdict becomes visible, the judgment behind it has already been made.